Greetings, brethren and sisters. This is Gillie Priest of Gillie Priest Revolutionary Radio. And today I want to build the reasoning around feminization and masculinization. Femininity and masculinity. And a lot of time when we use those two terms, the brain automatically tends to go to male and female. Well, in this reasoning today, male and female is going to be a minute aspect within the reasoning of femininity and masculinity. And the reason why I decided to build the reasoning, because there are various topics I can touch upon. But the reason why I decided to build the reason around femininity and masculinity is because those two terms impacts everything within creation. And if we are able to come to a better understanding of these terms, it will help us to better reflect upon our individual self. Now, I began by saying that everything in creation is encompassed within masculinity and femininity. I don't care what it is. Everything conceives and everything gives birth. Nothing remains constant. You understand? And we don't need to get in the cliche of the only thing that constant is change. That's a given. So we are going to expand the thinking capacity there by looking more in depth at masculinity and femininity. Now, when you look at all creation story, no matter what it is, and we are not going to look at any creation story from a belief, from an emotional attachment space, but strictly from the reasoning using the mind. Us as a people in oppression, we tend to see our natural enemy without ourselves as something out there. And for us as African, we tend to see members of the European race as a race that is diametrically opposed to the development of the African race. But if you look at other races, and even though Europe had traversed the world, basically at one time conquered all people from different perspectives, or a segment of all people from different perspectives. If you travel, for example, and go to China, even though the Chinese people may look upon the European as one of the main aggressors against their nation, say for the last few hundred years, they do not tend to categorize the European race as a chief number one protagonist. That position they tend to reserve for the Japanese. And if you go within China itself, amongst the various ethnic groups, I think they have over 600 and something ethnic groups. Some of these different ethnic groups may not even see the Japanese as their number one protagonists. They may see other different ethnic groups based upon their own historical development. So what this has shown us is that different groups have what they can term their natural enemies. I'm using that term within a context. You go to Europe, And within Europe itself, you find a different construct of what a natural enemy is. The Polish people tend to look upon the German as their natural enemy. The Russian as their own natural enemy. The British as their own, just within Europe. And in all these examples that I've drawn upon at the beginning of this reasoning is to evaluate and identify a process to show you that whenever you have two people or two nations or multiple nations that struggle against each other through a developmental process, these struggles always takes on a masculine versus feminine type of struggle. And the dominant nation, the nation that were able to evolve as the dominant force against that group that is seen as his natural enemy, always tries to subdue their enemy into a femininity position, try to feminize that enemy. Meaning that the conquering nation, the stronger nation, tends to take on all the characteristics of masculinity and reserve for those who they oppress the role of femininity. If we look at plants, these two different roles are usually most easily identifiable. You have male plants and you have female plants. And we can tend to identify the characteristics of these two different plants. You go in the animal kingdom, we can easily identify those animals within their own group who are of masculine and feminine characteristics. And we can also identify those two terms in between different animals, where one group of animal dominates another group of animal and regulates the dominated group in a feminine position. Now, in developing this reason, there are certain thinking process, certain prejudicial thinking process that I would like us to stay away from, in order so the reason can develop more profoundly. And what I've already identified, let's stay away from a minute from male, female, man, woman, because when we speak in terms of femininity and masculinity, our brain tend to easily get sidetracked to the male and female human species. Another prejudicial thought I would like us to set aside for a moment is that masculinity is superior to femininity. I want us to put whatever prejudice we may have between those two principles aside for this reasoning. We're just going to take them as two principles of equal footing in terms of within nature. But when man applies these two terms, again, our own prejudicial and cultural development tends to equate masculinity with superiority and femininity with inferiority. That's what I'm trying to push aside for a minute. So when you go back to the creation stories, if you take one of the creation stories, for example, of Christianity, there are two creation stories in the Bible, and we are not here to contest whether they're right or wrong. One, God created man, and then he pulls the woman out of the rib. In that process right there, just looking at the process itself, Man created first, then woman came from man. Now we're looking at the act itself now, not of this the male or female aspect, but the act of creating one group of the human species first, that is created independent of anything else except the involvement of God, is seen as a masculine act. The subordinate act of taking the woman from the rib of the man is seen as a feminine, inferior act. It has to come through a third, basically, party. If we take these mathematics and apply it to plants, we have the feminine plant and the masculine plant. And when you look at the principles that are embedded within these two terms, masculinity and femininity, on a general sense, masculinity tends to give and femininity tends to receive. Like, for example, the earth is usually referred to in a context of being Mother Earth. Why? Because the earth receives. You plant a seed within the earth, then the earth gives birth to plants. So it is going through that feminine regurgitation of receiving and giving. You can apply those two principles to the human species, where the male impregnates the female, or you go to the animal kingdom where the male animal impregnates the female animal, and they perform the same. One gives and one takes. One gives birth to, one helps the conception process. And whatever within creation you want to observe and study and look at, it encompasses those two principles. A prejudicial approach to it always comes in when you inject the human emotions in it, and the cultural prerogatives of people, where one set of the same species try to dominate another set of the same species. So let's narrow down this reason by just giving that brief synopsis of masculinity and femininity. Whenever a nation sets out to conquer another nation, or conquer another ethnic group, or conquer another race, because of the prejudicial development of the human mind and brain over centuries, we tend to take on these masculinity and femininity processes, the processes of these two disciplines, whenever we encounter another people and try to subdue. Now, when you look at the process of subduing a people, and we are going to employ the masculinity and femininity from the perspective of the human brain, not from the all things equal process of nature. Nature sees no prejudicial aspect to masculinity and femininity. Prejudicial aspect of femininity and masculinity gets involved when the human brain gets involved. Out there in nature, it is two equal potent force, one that cannot exist without the other. And what you find happening now with all of these different racial groups and ethnic groups that try to dominate each other is that the main prerogative of the dominant group, the one that is able to subdue the other group, is to subdue the other group within the capacity of femininity. And we as African people, who have been through this antagonistic existence with the Europeans, in subduing us as a people, their main objective was to subdue us into femininity, meaning that even the male African species were forced down into femininity, because within human relations, femininity is seen and taken as an inferior position. Now, from a sociological context, when human beings has access to resources that is necessary to their own liberty and development, access to that resources is also formed around the concept of masculinity, meaning, in a more generic terms, a man who is able to provide for his family as dictated by how society set the standard, that individual is seen as functioning within the world of masculinity. A man who cannot provide, from a psychological perspective, is forced into, and a lot of time takes on, a feminine characteristics. Now, I want to give you some social example that you can see play out every day within the community. On a micro level, you will find an individual who sees himself as a man, sees himself as a masculine man, whether from a physical strength perspective or because he's able to produce a certain amount of resources for himself, or whatever gives that individual a masculine view of himself. And when we go down into the garrison, like for example one in which I live, you tend to find individuals who are bombastic, which is a part of their own evaluation of what a masculine individual is. And they walk and carry themselves and exude a certain amount of masculinity to affirm and reaffirm that he is a man. And this is just an example I'm giving you. But then one day you will see the same individual, and a politician will come into the neighborhood, or a don of a higher status will come into the neighborhood, and this masculine individual that saw himself from a masculine position, whenever he approaches this politician or approaches a don that can exude more power than himself, if you sit back and observe, you will notice that this individual takes on a feminine role. So the more powerful don will pull up in a car, and the lesser don will approach the car. And what's going on, big man? Why go on, Ray? Let her have something. Let me get something. Free up something. And he goes through this role that is seen as a feminine role. It's almost as if he takes on a begging role, because a begging role is not seen as a masculine role. But this same individual now will return home to his woman, and for whatever psychological ineptness this individual may answer, even though a few minutes ago he had taken on this feminine role whenever he's in the presence of that who he recognizes as a more superior individual, this individual will go home and try to assert his masculinity upon his woman through the process of brutality, abuse, beatings. So for a lot of us within this society, we tackles between these two roles. Depends on who we are in front of, determines whether or not we take on the masculine role. And you're in front of another person that is seen as more powerful, you tend to take on the feminine role. Now let's take this role on a more macro level. When the Europeans conquered us and took us into captive, and the same principle applies even to those who remain in Africa, but I want to concentrate for a minute on those that they took to the West. Right? But it equally applies to those that were still remained in Africa after the transatlantic slave trade. We as Africans who were brought into the West was subdued as a group to such a degraded level that the entire set, or the almost entire group of us that was brought into the West, was subdued into femininity. With our very existence, food, clothing, shelter, and the preservation of our life was reserved to the good grace of the European race. We were at a time when each and every member of our race had no control over our very life. A master could walk out of his house and say, take his life. And that would have been done. And equally attached to this feminization of our people for centuries was creating individuals amongst our race from a caricature position, where they would take certain individuals from amongst us, the oppressed people, and tag them with historical names to which these individuals bear no characteristics. So when you run around on all these plantations, you find some slaves that are named like Caesar, Augustus, Samson, all these great biblical and historical European names. These names were given to certain slaves who were functioning within an overseeing capacity in order to elevate them a degree above their fellow oppressed people, so they could be used as an instrument of oppression against their very own. Yet, these caricature people who were elevated to this fake status did not escape the feminization process that was imposed upon the African race. But they were led to believe that to a minute degree they were distinguishable from the masses of their fellow men. Coming out of the plantation process and coming through the process of colonialism, they imposed upon us the concept of the mother country. The former slave masters, nations, that ruled over us through the entire colonial process. And the feminization of the entire race continued, because even coming up during the time of colonialism, we had no control over our very existence. We became beggars, which was seen as a feminization process. Today you still have African nations that is seen as a beggar nations. And through the entire feminization process, the Europeans has reserved unto themselves those discipline and principles that are identified with masculinity. So when we take this masculinity and this femininity and apply it to all actions and interactions and interrelations between people, we can see the deliberateness of our feminization. We can see in instances where when some of us goes into the presence of Europeans, the entire characteristics and feature changes to a feminized one. We tend to try to please these people intellectually, mentally, spiritually, physically. And whenever you find yourself within that disposition where you feel almost compelled to please, it is a process of your own feminization. Once they are able to establish themselves as a dominant masculine force within any relationship, then what that naturally encompasses is your very degradation of your own humanity. And when you have an entire race where the male and the female are feminized, then not even the female within your own race can respect you as a masculine representation of a human being. So you may act and convince yourself that you are a masculine male, but within your interrelation with the outer species, every single aspect of your existence is one of femininity. When Africans go to world conferences, all they do is beg. All they do is plead. No one around that table that is not a member of the race can impose any policy that has to take the African race into consideration if they don't feel like. So this internationalization of the feminization of the entire African race manifests itself in our inability to mentally cipher out the circumstances within which we have found and placed ourselves all these centuries. The way how we deal with our women, because we are incapable of living and existing from a masculine perspective, our psychological shortfalls led us to abuse our women, abandon our children, and degrade ourselves in front of all the different races upon the face of the earth. And even sometimes we may encounter members of our race who are able to provide a certain social status for themselves and their family. If you closely observe to the end of the line, or rather the beginning of the line from where these resources comes from, it always ends with someone or begins with someone who are of a different racial group. Now let's look at Jamaica. And this equally applies to any country on the face of the earth. You take all the main industries in this country, those who control the means of production in this country, it's basically members of a totally different race. So when you find an African, for the vast majority of the time, who can live at a social acceptable level financially, is usually a person who still has to depend on that external race in order to live at his social status. So our feminization as a people has affected us so much psychologically that even to challenge our protagonists to seek liberation for ourselves and our people has always, if not most of the time, take on a feminine role in order to seek liberation. Now what do I mean by that? Because our whole psychological makeup has been formed from a femininity position. Our chief way of looking at how to liberate ourselves is never from a masculine perspective. And that is one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, why we have submitted ourselves to such degrading position over the centuries, position that other people would never have submitted themselves to. And it has nothing to do with us as a race. It has to do with the longevity of the feminization of our entire group, racial group. Now let's go back to the micro level, because how this feminization plays out itself on the micro level, it affects the future generation. Because when a man come home and he faces his woman and he cannot provide for his woman and his family, it leads naturally to abuse. It leads naturally to dictatorship within the home, where in order to retain a false sense of masculinity, we abuse our women, we beat them, we deny them, we dictate to them, we demand that they do not think. Because we believe that if the female within our house is able to live out our true countenance, it's gonna expose the femininity that the man is existing in. Yeah, man, so we go home and we abuse the woman. Because in some way we believe that make us feel like we are more masculine. But what I want us to zoom in on is the deliberateness of feminizing an entire race in order to maintain a sense of subduedness amongst these people, prevent the male from living out a masculine existence, which is a necessary form of existing in order to provide efficiently for himself and his family. So not only Africans as an individual has been subdued into femininity, but their nations has been subdued into femininity. Globally, the entire race has been subdued into femininity. Economically, politically, religiously. You can analyze this femininity from the perspective that each and every aspect of our existence is controlled by members of an external race. That's how much we have been subdued into femininity. And I know these terms, when I say we are being subdued into these terms, it's going to offend a lot of people. Offend a lot of people. But when you face reality, and you can go down to the granular level and identify each and every aspect that is necessary to the human existence, and you can recognize that at this granular level, each and every aspect is controlled by members of a different race, then they have put us in a position just like a woman that remains home and has to totally depend for her existence upon her husband coming home. And whenever the husband is displeased with his wife about anything, he withholds and he denies her. That is the same way we as an entire race has been treated for more than 400 years. Whenever we engendered any displeasure, even the most minutest displeasure within our racial protagonists, they exert their displeasure by imposing sanctions, whether on the individual or on the group or on the nation or on the race. The imposition of sanction is an expression of the displeasure that you are feeling to retain your feminine role in your interaction with them. And all of their institutions function from that basic principle. The IMF, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, all regional organizations, all hemispheric organizations, they function from that basic principle. If you offend the masculinity of the European race, you shall be reminded of your feminization through the process of sanction. And again, if you carry it down on the micro level, you are and you can be hired and fired based upon your failure to retain your feminization within your interrelation with members of the other race. We have seen where over the last, let's say, 50 years, to different degrees within different groups, different countries, different nations, where the Africans and people of African descent are slowly trying to break out of this feminization process that was imposed upon us. You know, even when I attended certain educational institutions in the United States, certain great European institutions in the United States, just the ability to express your independent thought in this classroom, the ability to do that, I have seen Africans and people of African descent struggle to give true expressions to their feelings because they fear to offend any member of the European race. And you have to remember that when we speak of relation with the European race and they have reserved unto themselves a masculine position, that includes the European woman within that race. The black male of the African race has to envelope himself within a femininity, even in his relationship to the female species of the European race. And he knows that if he oversteps his bound in his relation with that member of female European race, he shall pay the penalty. And I've seen where entire groups of minorities within these illustrious European universities subdue their own thought process, their own belief, their own knowledge, and spews out some pleasing words to satisfy and not to disrupt the comfortability of the professors within the classroom. You've seen it every day in your interaction, even if you go into a supermarket. And if a black male or female acts boisterous and give full expression to our emotional displeasure towards something that takes place in the store, you can see where members of our own race becomes embarrassed, almost want to apologize to the proprietors of a different race concerning the conduct of this African male or female who is giving full expression to their displeasure about something concerning the service within the store. We see it every day. We see where on that micro level we subdue our own natural instinct and proclivity to give full expression to how we are feeling to members of the external race. But when we have to take into consideration the penalties that may be imposed on us as individuals, we become subdued. We see it on the national level. We are exemplified in Jamaica where any displeasure directed towards the American empire, one of the first things you always hear them say, the American embassy is looking into certain people in the country that has visas. They do not even have to withhold the visas to certain people within the country. You just have to hear that there's a slowing of the process in processing visas, and you see how much we turn around and attack ourselves. We become the attack dogs for our racial protagonists because we have this inborn planted fear of exuding any exception to the thought and doings of the European race. And when you take it on an international level, within any international organization in which the Africans is given a seat, he or she has to take on the feminine role if he or she wants to be fully accepted. They can never be fully accepted, but on a more superficial level, if he or she desires to be seen as intelligent, seen as educated, then any opinion to which they may give expression has to conform to the opinion expression of the Europeans who sit around that table. Now, how do we break out of this feminization? How do we develop ourselves into true revolutionaries? Because you cannot be a true revolutionary while remaining in that feminization role, while remaining within that feminine role when it comes to our interaction with our racial protagonists. To say it another way, unless we break out of this feminine role that we as man and woman has been placed into, then our full and true liberation will be nothing but a dream, an illusion, like His Majesty said, to be pursued and never attained. And if you look at, for example, China or India, two major nation and racial group upon the face of this earth, you can see the evolution of the expression of their mental capacity to the European race, how it developed over the decades, where today how an Indian or a Chinese give full expression in their interrelation with the European race. It was never like that 50 years ago. The highest Chinese diplomat or government official, or the highest Indian diplomat or government official today is incomparable to their equivalent 50 years ago, meaning the way that a Chinese or an Indian government official can speak to a European today, he could not have done that 50 years ago without suffering the displeasure through sanctions and killings and other means of the European nations. But today they are in a different position. We as Africans as of yet escaped where we were 50 years ago. So today, we still have to keep our mouth. Even when we are government official, you have to keep your mouth. You have to bite your own words. You have to swallow your tongue. Even though you are a representative of an African or an African descent nation, when you are dealing with the European nations, or the Chinese nation, or the Japanese nation, or the Indian nation. It is readily conceived and accepted that we are still encased within that feminine role. The role that we expect from a prejudicial and an ignorant mind. How our woman must deal with us. That is the same way the protagonist nations expects us to deal with them, or else suffer the penalty. So when you put these things in a simplified terms, the way how the disempowered African man, the way how the disempowered black man, who is enveloped in a certain levels of unconsciousness, subdue and abuses his woman and his children, is the same way members of the external races expects and do deal with us as African and African descent male of the African race. So we are tackled between these two existences. We exert a certain sense of false masculinity upon our women and children, and then revert to a feminine role when dealing with members of the external race because of our fear of being sanctioned economically, physically, spiritually, religiously, and upon all other levels of allergies. So we have to recognize this, and we have to look at ourselves, and we have to ask ourselves on the micro level, why do we treat our women and kids the way that we treat them, abuse them? And then when we turn the other direction and faces our historical protagonists, we do not have that aggression against them. Once we go through that door and goes out in the street, that aggression disappears. And as soon as we come home and get in the house, we get all masculine again. Look on them things, man. Give them things some thought, man. You know? Some of us, tell you something of my experience. When I was in prison, and even before I went to prison, but living in the free society in the United States, I used to witness the natural fear of the representative of my government when they are dealing with not even just members of the United States government, whether on the local, regional, or national level, but just in their interaction with the Europeans. A lot of them in their relation with these people became submissive. And these are people who are representing us on a national level. And when you encounter these individuals within the confines of the Jamaican border, then all of a sudden you see they get aggressive and masculine with you. It's just like a criminal, you know. A criminal. A criminal with a gun sees himself as the most masculine representation of himself. Speak to you aggressive, disrespect you, disrespect his family. Because the gun is an extension of his fake sense of masculinity. And I tell you, when I encounter some of these people within the prison system, some of the people, some criminals with some of the most famous names in Jamaica and famous names on the streets of New York, black Americans, when they come in at the prison system, them broke down, them cry, them inform on people. Yeah, man. Some of them when they come in a prison, man, if someone will not stand up, them cannot use the phone. Them cannot go to the yard. Them cannot buy commissary. Them go to the commissary, man, hold them and take away them commissary from them. These are the same people on the street with a gun or a weapon in their hand drive the most insidious fear within their own community. Names known throughout the country. So once them come into the system where them don't have a gun, softer than them you cannot find. Yeah, man. That's the same thing on the international level. Same thing on the international. Remember the whole process where the United States wanted to bring up Christopher Coke. That time I believe Prime Minister Golden was in power. I'm going to draw on a parallel. At the same time when the United States government under Barack Obama was demanding the extradition of Christopher Coke, aka Dulles, to the United States, I was appealing to the Jamaican government for help to prove my innocence so I could come back home. The various governments in Jamaica did little or nothing to assist in me proving my innocence. But look what the nation went through in order not to displease the desires and wishes of the United States government. Look what this nation went through just to turn one man over to the United States government. That is the way we act under each and every circumstances in order not to displease the wishes of our racial protagonists. We will destroy this nation to please those racial protagonists. But we will not exude 1/10 of that aggressiveness against the same European in order to free one of our own citizens. And keep in mind, I was imprisoned in the United States because I would not fabricate a statement against the Jamaican government leading up to the 1980 election. So when we speak in a summary, when we speak of the feminization of an entire race, you are speaking of you controlling each and every aspect of that race so that racial group can never ever give full expressions to who they are as a people. So keep that in mind. All things in nature develops out of a masculine and feminine perspective, including male and female. when you're speaking sociologically, when you subdue any group of human being to place exclusively a feminine role within the interrelation with another racial group, that is what you find leads to our inability to aggressively pursue freedom the way that we should pursue freedom as human beings. So that's it on the reasoning, the bridge. Me just want to touch upon that. And as usual, the production forged by time. And some brethren contacted me about this book, asking me, okay, this book is on Amazon. You just have to go on Amazon and plug in Forged by Time, and you'll be able to receive your copy. Amazon has now begun shipping books to the West Indies, to the Caribbean. Prior to this, they were only shipping books to European countries, England, and so forth. And like I stated before, my objective is to sell 1 million copies. And the reason why I say my objective is to sell 1 million copies is because, not only because 1 million is 1 million, but because part of my dreams and aspiration is just to see if I can accomplish that. To say, well, I sold 1 million copies of this book. And again, it is on Amazon. I must also say to the brethren that I've received good advice, great advice on how to upgrade the making of these videos for Revolutionary Radio. But to be honest with you, I'm very lacking technologically, and I'm gradually trying to learn the process. And I really and truly appreciate the fact that the brethren and sisters who have contacted me through emails and other process and trying to impart to me the knowledge of making this product a better product, a more enhancing product, a more encompassing product. I really appreciate that, man. And if you can remember one of the earlier broadcasts that I did play an axe of help, and I really and truly appreciate it. And I've seen over the months the growth and development that has been attained from the advice that has been given to me. First and foremost, by the badass out of England and the other brethren, them will contact me. So bear with me that sometimes when you give me advice and how to enhance the product, I really do not have the technological skill to enhance. I understand that people have told me you can go on Google and you can go on YouTube, but sometimes I get caught up in so many different things, different pursuits, that I really have the time to go and do the research. So, but what I do sometimes is just play around with the technology and try to better develop the product, you know. So thanks again, thanks very much. Keep the positive critiques coming, keep the advice coming, keep enhancing my knowledge when it comes to this technology, and I hope that one day it will evolve to that level where someone can look back and say, yes, I've seen the progress with the brethren who have developed this program and this platform. Yeah. So until that time, brethren and sisters, keep asking the brethren if you also subscribe. Keep expanding this knowledge by telling other brethren and sisters about this, so them can tune in and get a vibe for them friends and see what it feel like. You know? So respect and manners and everything, family. One God, one name, one destiny, peace, love and unity. This is Rastafari program. And at the same time, this is bigger than a Rastafari program. This is an evolutionary program. This is expanding the mind. This is about growing. This is about development. This is about enjoying reasoning. You know, say one thing before I close off. So that is not the prison system. And them reasoning now we go on with the Rastafari tabernacle in the prison in New York State, you know. Yeah, man, sometimes I had 100 man, 150 man in the room. And I will say, alright, make we take a break and drink some water. Yeah, man, we rise up and say, no water break, man. Because we are trying to catch all of the reason before we have to go back in the cage for the night. And it was an enhancing feeling for the people who have been convicted for all type of heinous crime, for all type of low, no matter what the degree of the crime is. Individuals who society has given up on. I see them man start rebel against time break and say, oh, the reason we don't take no food break. We don't go back at this cage, you can go eat some food. We don't take no food break. It will make me know, so man, there is hope for the most vilest individual, man. If you catch him and groom him or she right. We love knowledge, man. There are people who have given this world all at the necessary foundation of all faculties and education in this world. And we do it, man. And I see the joy and the pleasure when we expose our comrades to these things. So make we keep it going, man. Make we see the Gillie Peace Revolutionary Radio as a banner bearer, man, as a flag carrier towards the liberation of our people. So until that time, brethren, peace out.